Anya Tish Gallery is pleased to present Desire Lines, the gallery's inaugural exhibition of Houston-based artist Gabriel Martinez. Drawing on the history of both quilting and painting, the exhibition features hand-stitched fabric paintings created from clothing found in the streets of Houston. Martinez employs the concept of the trace to explore spaces created for the body, such as garments, neighborhoods, factories, and quilts, and the way bodies in turn affect and mark those spaces. The works in Desire Lines situate the artist as one body among many involved in the manipulation of the material. The paintings record the traces of global capital, evoking those who dyed and printed the fabric, those who assembled the garments, the people who wore and lost them, as well as the artist who places them back into circulation as luxury objects. They are an invitation for the viewer to consider not only their formal composition and the laborious nature of their production, but also the disjunctive economies that enable such value shifts.
It begins before I even sit down in the studio with the fabric, and it really begins on my movements through the city, walking, riding my bike, driving my truck. I grab the fabric and I soak it and wash it and take it home. I cut up all of the sleeves, zippers, buttons, all the tags, and what I'm left with is flat fabric which retains the garment's structural shapes. And I use those structural shapes as the initial compositional sort of tools, as the initial sort of brush strokes of the paintings. I compose with those pieces and I work the sort of canvas until I come up with something that I like. When there's extra that's overlapped, I'll cut it out and I'll throw it back in the box of fabric. And eventually I'll get to a place where I'm using smaller pieces that retain less of the original garment structure. And so you can see, like on these two, for instance, I'm using scraps of scraps, pieces, mostly pieces that have already been cut off and used on other pieces. This one in particular has probably the most sources of different garments. It also, because of that, has some of the most varied textures and shapes because they're the smaller scraps. I have several quilts. I differ from their style in that I'm only doing crazy quilts. I'm not making patterns. I kind of fight the patterns. The only patterns that I really end up having are some of the garment shapes. Occasionally you can see like the shape of a sleeve or the opening of a neck hole. But I drew from that history of my mom and my grandma and my great-grandmother as creators, as people who made work my whole life in their home. Seeing my mom sew, having her give me all of the tools and always have that stuff available, definitely led me to return to this as an art form later. This piece channel was made with help from a grant from the HAA, and I wanted this one on the ground because it broke the sort of privileged 45-degree angle of all the other works, and it denies like a top or a bottom to the piece. Similarly, I wanted the viewer to not really be able to take in the whole piece from a single vantage point and have to move closer, move around, and really engage with it, with their body as they move through it. I also wanted this one to be on the ground to invoke a body of water. I was thinking about the influences of the garment industry on climate change and the massive amount of water it requires to produce cotton and even like a men's t-shirt. It's like 700 gallons. I wanted to draw attention to that. This one, like the others, is entirely hand-stitched. Here you can see some of the work on the back. So the stitch lines are the slowest part of the composition and allow me to kind of get a little more subtle. They also allow me to test different compositional techniques. If you look at some of the different pieces in this show, they are done at different times. Some are real early and they're more architectonic shapes. Some are much more organic shapes. Some retain the original garment much more clearly than the others. But the shapes of fabric are kind of like painterly parts, and the stitching is the linear quality, like the drawing. So I sew everything down and I start to do the quilting lines, and it's like it's moved into the drawing phase. I gather these, like I've said, as I move through the city, and once they're on the composition, I move across this like a neighborhood as I kind of trace out each of these areas and sew them down. So it kind of, I always think of cartoons where movement line is depicted by little dotted lines of kind of footprints moving through the space. One of my interests with this series of works is to consider the history of the materials, starting as fabric, starting as cotton. I wanted to really I wanted to honor the bodies that manipulated the material. I wanted the bodies that came in contact with this material, the people that dyed fabric, the people that assembled the garments, the people that shipped and sold and wore them in Houston and eventually lost them before I found them. I keep each of the pieces in a portrait orientation to invoke the bodies of the garment industry, the bodies that toiled to bring these. It is an unsustainable industry, and I think we will see a lot of changes in the future with the garment industry. This piece, which I've called Cumulus, has been produced with the help of anyone who's visited the show who wanted to write down the countries that were listed on the tags of their garments or their bags or their shoes. And it kind of shows us the repetition of where the clothes come from. There's actually a pretty big variety here, but I've gathered them from the streets, I've cut all the tags off, and I have a running list of all the countries that I've seen. And it's about probably less than 20 for the majority of the world's clothes. How close the manufacturers, how close manufacturing and warfare are. Because these are all countries that we have had a military issue with. Specifically the fact that Vietnam makes so much of our clothes. Like 45 years after, not even 45 years later, this started as the sweatshop as we know it. Started as part of Reagan's Caribbean Basin Initiative to prevent communism from spreading in the Caribbean from Cuba, and it was intended to improve the lives of people who were building these. We're assembling the garments, but the real advantage for the garment industry was that it made American companies competitive with Asia, which at the time Asia was making garments, but they weren't really being sold here. That allowed for the very beginning legal structures of sending labor to other countries, but still selling it in the US. It was kind of the sort of beginning of that. And they look like they have shapes and they're round. You could draw them. But when you fly through the cloud, when you're up close, there is no edge. You don't know if you're actually in it or not. And that distance from particles is what allows us to understand the world as being created of different materials. But in reality, it's these fields of reactions. The distance from the work, the artwork, allows the viewer to see it as a painting instead of a conglomerate of all of these actions, of all of these histories, of all of these bodies. They're like a cloud that you see from afar, which holds its shape because you're far enough away from it. But as you get closer, you realize and you see with these pieces, there's always more stitches behind my stitches, more labor behind my labor, more bodies behind my laboring body. And as you get closer, those edges, just like a cloud, disappear, and it's not as easily defined. I am interested in that element of the work and interested in making work with material that nets all of us, that no one who walks in the show is outside of this system of industry, including myself. And I think being close to it and spending time with them, sewing them and working on them at such a slow pace allowed me to kind of do some of the intellectual labor, the heavy lifting of thinking through these pieces. And I think the closer I get to them and the closer the more I think, the more that is revealed to me, just beyond the scope of the piece itself.
Born in New Mexico, Gabriel Martinez is an artist and performer living and working in Houston. He graduated with a BFA from Corcoran College of Art and Design, an MFA from Columbia University, and attended the rigorous Whitney Independent Study Program before moving to Houston as a Museum of Fine Arts Core Fellow and Artist in Residence at Project Row Houses.